Few images evoke a sense of ancient Egypt more than this, the face of Nefertiti. She was the wife of a pharaoh and the stepmother to another.
For more than 100 years, the bust of Nefertiti has been celebrated as one of the most beautiful faces in ancient history. Millions have stood before it, staring into the calm eyes of an Egyptian queen who seems almost too perfect to be real. But what if that face was never meant to be seen? When scientists used a CT scanner to look beneath the painted plaster, they discovered something hidden inside the limestone. A second face, sharper features, subtle wrinkles, a more human, imperfect version of the woman we thought we knew. Before we uncover what was hidden beneath that famous face, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this, because what scientists found beneath the surface may completely change the way we see Nefertiti and the story behind the most famous face of ancient Egypt. And that discovery raises a disturbing question. Was the famous face of Nefertiti actually designed to show the queen as she was, or as someone in power needed her to appear? What was hidden beneath the surface could change the way we understand one of ancient Egypt's most iconic figures. The mystery begins more than 3,000 years ago in the lost Egyptian capital of Amarna. The limestone bust of Nefertiti was created more than 3,000 years ago, then disappeared from history until a German archaeological expedition uncovered it at Amarna in 1912. At first, there was no inscription identifying the woman, no royal cartouche, no name carved into the stone, just an extraordinary face. It took years of comparing the sculpture with surviving temple reliefs and other images from the Amarna period before scholars became convinced that the woman was almost certainly Nefertiti, the great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt around 1353 to 1336 BCE. The bust was eventually transported to Berlin, placed behind glass, and transformed into one of the most recognizable ancient artworks in the world. But decades later, scientists decided they wanted to know something no one could see with the naked eye. What was actually underneath that perfect face? They turned to computed tomography, or CT scanning, the same basic technology used in hospitals, adapted for archaeological objects. X-rays were directed through the sculpture from hundreds of different angles, allowing researchers to reconstruct its interior layer by layer without damaging the ancient surface. When the images appeared, the team expected to find exactly what conventional wisdom had predicted: a solid limestone core covered by a thin layer of plaster, forming a refined but straightforward royal portrait. Instead, the scan revealed something far more complicated. Beneath the famous painted surface was another face. The hidden version looked noticeably different. The nose was longer and more sharply defined. There were subtle creases around the mouth and beneath the eyes. The cheekbones had a different shape, and the face was not perfectly symmetrical. This wasn't the flawless, almost supernatural woman displayed behind museum glass. It was an older-looking, more natural human face, and that meant someone had intentionally covered it. The sculptor had taken one version of the woman and transformed it into another. And that raises an unsettling question. Why? Thutmose was not an inexperienced craftsman. He was a master sculptor working under royal patronage. If he had originally created a more realistic and slightly imperfect likeness, why would he cover it with plaster and reshape the face into the flawless image we recognize today? To understand that, we have to step into one of the most turbulent periods in ancient Egyptian history. Nefertiti's husband, Akhenaten, attempted something almost unimaginable. He challenged the religious system that had defined Egypt for generations. The traditional temples were closed or stripped of their influence. powerful priesthoods lost land, wealth, and authority. Akhenaten elevated a single deity above the old pantheon, the Aten, represented by the visible disk of the sun. And he placed himself and Nefertiti at the center of this new religious order. Then he abandoned the traditional capital and established an entirely new city in the desert. It was an extraordinary transformation of Egyptian society. And Nefertiti wasn't simply standing beside it as a queen. She became one of its most important public symbols. Art from the Amarna period repeatedly places her beside Akhenaten during religious ceremonies. In some scenes, she appears performing roles that had traditionally been associated with the pharaoh himself. There are even reliefs showing her raising a weapon against defeated enemies, a representation that would have been almost unthinkable for an Egyptian queen of earlier periods. Her position may have extended far beyond that of a ceremonial royal wife. She was part of the message, part of the power, part of the new ideology. And suddenly, the mysterious bust begins to look very different. This wasn't necessarily a private portrait created simply to remember what Nefertiti looked like. It may have served a much larger purpose. The idealized face, the smooth skin, balanced features, youthful appearance, and almost impossible perfection was exactly the kind of image a revolutionary royal regime could use. Egyptian society was being forced to accept a completely new religious order. The old gods were being pushed aside. The traditional priesthood was being weakened. And at the center of this transformation stood Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Their images had to communicate power, perfection, and divine legitimacy. So perhaps the bust wasn't intended to show Nefertiti exactly as she appeared in everyday life. Perhaps it showed the version of Nefertiti the regime wanted Egypt to see. And there's another detail that makes the story even more fascinating. The sculpture was discovered inside a sculptor's workshop, not inside a royal tomb, not inside a temple, a workshop. That matters because such a sculpture could have functioned as a model for other artists, a master reference that helped establish how the queen was supposed to be represented. If that interpretation is correct, the face behind the glass wasn't simply an individual portrait. It was a blueprint for an image that could be copied, repeated, standardized, until people throughout the kingdom encountered the same carefully controlled version of their queen. For more than a century, millions of people have looked at that face and imagined they were seeing the real Nefertiti. But what if they were actually seeing an ideal? A carefully constructed royal image hiding a more human face beneath it? The famous bust may not simply be a portrait. It may be a mask. And if that is true, then the hidden face beneath the plaster is only the beginning. Because Nefertiti's story contains something even darker, the disappearance of her name, the destruction of her family's legacy, the fate of her daughters, and the possibility that her final resting place still lies undiscovered. The deeper we peel away the layers surrounding Nefertiti, the more questions appear. And the next mystery begins with something even more powerful than her face, her name. This is where the story takes a much darker turn. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's 17-year reign, Nefertiti suddenly disappears. There is no recorded announcement of her death, no known funeral ceremony, no confirmed burial, no official explanation. For a woman who had appeared throughout the royal imagery of the Amarna period, her disappearance from the historical record is extraordinary. For generations, historians suggested that she may have died from disease or an epidemic, with her record simply disappearing over time. But the archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. At several sites connected to the final years of Akhenaten's reign, researchers noticed something that was difficult to explain as ordinary damage. Nefertiti's name had been deliberately removed. Her inscriptions weren't merely worn away by weather or damaged by age. They had been physically carved out and, in some cases, replaced with another royal name. And this wasn't an isolated alteration. The same pattern appeared across multiple monuments. Someone had gone back to the inscriptions and intentionally changed the official record. Then another name began appearing with increasing importance: Nefertiti, a mysterious ruler who seems to have governed for a brief period between Akhenaten's death and the eventual rise of Tutankhamun. But the inscriptions surrounding this ruler contain an extraordinary clue. The royal titles associated with Nefertiti repeatedly use feminine grammatical forms. The pronouns are feminine. The grammatical endings are feminine. The language itself consistently points toward a woman. So who was she? Egyptologist James Allen and several other researchers have spent years examining these inscriptions in extraordinary detail. Their argument is that Nefertiti may not have been a completely separate historical figure at all. She may have been Nefertiti under another royal identity. According to this interpretation, after Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti could have taken the throne herself and ruled Egypt under the name Nefertiti. The evidence they point to includes duplicated cartouches, specific royal epithets, and the feminine grammatical forms attached to the ruler's titles. Piece by piece, the case becomes difficult to dismiss. And Egypt had already seen something similar. Hatshepsut had previously transformed her royal identity in order to rule as pharaoh. But whatever happened to Nefertiti next appears to have been far more destructive. The clues lead directly into the tomb of Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter discovered the young king's burial chamber in 1922, researchers later noticed something unusual among the treasures. Object after object showed signs of modification. Jewelry, coffins, funerary equipment, and other royal objects had clearly been altered. Earlier names had been scraped away. Female pronouns were changed into male ones. Names were carved out and replaced. The work often appeared rushed, as though these objects needed to be transformed quickly for a new owner. That raises a remarkable possibility. Some of the treasures buried with Tutankhamun may not have originally been created for him at all. They may have belonged to an earlier ruler, possibly Nefertiti during her time as Nefertiti, and were rapidly converted for the young king after a sudden change in the royal succession. If that interpretation is correct, then Nefertiti's legacy wasn't simply forgotten. It was actively removed. Her identity was stripped from objects and replaced. Her possessions were reassigned. Her history was rewritten. And suddenly, that famous bust in Berlin becomes even more intriguing. A masterpiece depicting one of the most important women of ancient Egypt, yet carrying no inscription identifying her. No name, no royal title, nothing. So ask yourself, why would a woman who appeared across royal monuments be represented in one of Egypt's greatest sculptures without a single identifying mark? Who benefited from keeping her anonymous? And if her name could be erased, what happened to her body? That question leads us into another mystery. In 1817, explorers working in the Valley of the Kings entered a small, unfinished burial chamber that would later be designated KV-21. Inside were two female mummies. Neither had a name. There were no clear royal inscriptions identifying them, and their burial equipment offered few definitive answers. One of the women, later designated KV-21b, was found with her left arm positioned across her chest in a posture associated with royal burials. Her hand was clenched, almost as though it had once held a royal symbol or scepter. Everything about her suggested high status, but her identity remained unknown. For almost 2 centuries, the technology simply wasn't available to answer the question. The remains were badly damaged, making older genetic methods difficult to use. Then modern DNA analysis changed the situation. In 2022, an international research team used advanced sequencing techniques capable of extracting genetic information from extremely small and degraded samples. Researchers were able to recover a mitochondrial DNA profile from KV21b, and that result immediately raised the stakes. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the maternal line, making it particularly useful when researchers are trying to establish relationships between ancient individuals. The genetic evidence showed that KV21b shared a maternal lineage with Tutankhamun. She wasn't simply another unidentified royal woman. She was closely connected to the family of Egypt's most famous young pharaoh. The relationship could potentially have placed her in the role of mother, aunt, or older sister. But when the genetic evidence is combined with the archaeology and chronology of the Amarna royal family, one candidate begins to stand out: Nefertiti. Yet the identity wasn't necessarily the most disturbing discovery. The body itself presented a much darker possibility. Dr. Sahar Salem of Cairo University conducted detailed CT examinations of KV21b, examining the remains piece by piece. What she found raised serious questions. The injuries were not limited to ordinary deterioration. Both arms appeared severely damaged and twisted into unnatural positions. The rib cage showed significant crushing. The skull contained fractures along one side, with some edges appearing sharp rather than smoothly worn. Those patterns can indicate powerful physical trauma rather than simple damage caused by age or the collapse of a burial chamber. Salem's assessment was that at least some of these injuries may have occurred around the time of death. And that possibility changes everything. Because damage caused by thousands of years of pressure underground usually leaves a different pattern. The question is no longer simply whether this anonymous mummy could belong to Nefertiti. The more disturbing question is what happened to the woman inside the tomb. If KV21b really was Nefertiti, then the broken body may represent the final chapter of a story that began with a hidden face, continued with an erased name, and ended with a royal identity that someone desperately wanted Egypt to forget. When a body is damaged by the collapse of a tomb, the fractures usually follow recognizable patterns. The pressure creates breaks that tend to be rounded and predictable. But the injuries observed on KV21b don't appear to follow that pattern. The arms were twisted and broken into positions that would have been extremely difficult to produce naturally. Instead, their placement raises a far more disturbing possibility: that the woman may have been restrained while she was alive. The fractures on the skull are equally troubling. Some of them have sharp inward edges that could be consistent with a powerful impact from a heavy object. Taken together, these injuries don't read like a simple archaeological accident. They suggest violence. Now, consider the full picture. A high-status woman from the late 18th dynasty, genetically connected through the maternal line to Tutankhamun, buried anonymously in a tomb that appears inconsistent with the status she may have held, and a body showing evidence that could point toward severe physical trauma. Then place that beside the famous bust in Berlin. One shows an impossibly perfect royal woman. The other may preserve the remains of a real woman whose life ended in violence. If KV21b really was Nefertiti, the contrast is chilling. But even that isn't the strangest possibility, because there is another theory about where Nefertiti may have been buried, and it leads somewhere almost impossible to believe: a hidden chamber behind Tutankhamun's tomb. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves presented an idea that immediately sent shockwaves through the archaeological world. He believed Nefertiti's burial chamber could still be hidden behind the walls of the most famous tomb in Egypt, Tutankhamun's tomb, KV62. Reeves wasn't simply making a guess. He had spent months examining extremely detailed scans of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, created in 2014 by the Madrid-based company Factum Arte. Instead of studying the chamber from the floor like a normal visitor, Reeves repeatedly examined the digital images, magnifying tiny details that would be almost impossible to notice with the naked eye. Eventually, he focused on the northern and western walls, and he thought he saw something unusual: faint lines, geometric patterns, subtle changes in the surface that didn't seem to correspond with the natural structure of the limestone. To Reeves, they looked like the outlines of doorways that had once existed there, doorways later covered with plaster and painted over to make them disappear. And then came the bigger question: why would Tutankhamun's tomb contain something like that? KV62 is remarkably small compared with the enormous burial complexes normally associated with Egyptian pharaohs. Its layout also differs from the traditional royal tomb design. There are indications that the burial preparations happened unusually quickly. Reeves proposed a radical explanation. Perhaps the tomb wasn't originally constructed for Tutankhamun at all. Perhaps it had been prepared for an earlier royal figure, most likely Nefertiti. Then Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at a very young age, probably around 18 or 19. The royal burial had to happen immediately. So, according to Reeves's theory, workers may have sealed off the larger original chambers and adapted the existing entrance area for the young king. In other words, Tutankhamun may have been placed into a tomb that had originally been intended for someone far more important to the royal succession. Then came another discovery. In 2016, a Japanese research team used ground-penetrating radar to examine the area behind the northern wall. Their results reportedly indicated anomalies that could be consistent with an enclosed space. The possibility was enough to ignite worldwide headlines. For a moment, it seemed as though Nefertiti's tomb might finally be within reach. But the story didn't end there. In 2018, an Italian team returned with more advanced radar equipment and conducted another investigation. Their conclusion was very different. They reported that the earlier signals could be explained by natural variations within the limestone rather than hidden chambers. Two investigations, two dramatically different interpretations, and no definitive resolution. Researchers have pointed out that radar scanning inside dense stone isn't perfect. The angle of the scan, the equipment used, and the way the signals are interpreted can all influence the final conclusion. Reeves, however, has continued to defend his theory. Egyptian authorities have not authorized the kind of invasive investigation that could settle the issue once and for all. Because there is one obvious problem. To prove whether a chamber exists, researchers would potentially have to penetrate the wall. And drilling into one of the world's most important archaeological monuments is not a decision anyone is prepared to make casually. So, the mystery remains. It is still possible, at least in theory, that Nefertiti's final resting place could be concealed behind a painted wall inside a tomb that millions of people have visited. Imagine that. Every year, tourists stand inside Tutankhamun's tomb, only meters away from a possibility that has fascinated archaeologists for years. Now, go back to the bust in Berlin. A face with no name. And somewhere thousands of kilometers away, perhaps a body with no marker. Two fragments of the same mystery,